When we have a piece of news that we don't think our community is going to react to well, the initial instinct can be to try to keep that news private, to try to delay that communication. But in almost all situations, that's going to be the wrong call. This isn't to say we should necessarily rush out and make a huge fanfare about it. But typically, when we have a piece of bad news, we are much better off getting that news out into the community in a timely manner for several different reasons. First of all, if we choose to share that with our community, that gives us a lot more control over the way that message is delivered. We are able to provide a lot more context. We are able to explain why putting robots in our high fantasy game actually makes a lot of sense, even though they might not be expecting it. So by getting the news out on our timeline, as opposed to waiting until the game comes out or waiting until this information leaks, we're in control of the way the message comes out and the kind of information that comes along with it. Additionally, just having more conversations with your community are going to make them more receptive to listening to what you have to say. They're going to be more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. One of the reasons why developers with really good communities have those really good communities is because those developers are willing to talk to their communities, share news, share good news and bad news, and as a result, they have an ongoing conversation with their community, which gives them more grace when it comes to delivering a piece of news, a piece of information that their community doesn't like very much. This information is usually going to come out in some way or another. Either it is a feature that is added or removed from a game that people will see when the game comes out, or will be leaked, or will come out in the reviews, or it's something else that's going to make its way into the community. And in most cases, the moment of your launch isn't the time when you want the conversation to be about this feature you took out or added or changed in a way the community doesn't like. Better to have that conversation months before, even if it is objectively a bad thing, because this gives the community time to get mad at you and also, in most cases, to get over that anger, because as you share this, but then also share other things about your game, they are able to recontextualize their expectations. They are able to shift what they are expecting to get out of this game to better reflect reality. By letting them live in ignorance, you are anchoring their expectations on something that may no longer be true. And then when things come out and suddenly there are robots in their high fantasy game, then all they have is that initial knee-jerk reaction. You could have had that knee-jerk reaction 6 months ago by sharing some screenshots, and better by sharing some context as to why you put robots in your high fantasy game, and then allowing the community to chew on that and digest it and think about it and decide whether they liked it or not. And even if they still don't like it, you're giving them time to allow that emotion to filter down to a lower base level. The moment you feel that initial emotion, the moment you hear that initial piece of news is typically going to be the moment at which your emotions are going to be the most heightened. So if your expectation is that your community or some part of your community or even bad actors adjacent to your community are going to react in a negative way to something in your game, you are usually better off getting that news in front of them, getting that negative reaction, mitigating that reaction as best you can, and then allowing that news to retreat into the rearview mirror and moving past it. The reality is that, unfortunately, we live in a world where a lot of money, a lot of content is built on generating rage. If you have bad news come out at the most newsworthy moment in your media cycle, then there's money to be made in that moment. There's money to be made by making negative content, negative videos talking about your piece of bad news. And because most algorithms tend to pick engagement, and unfortunately, a lot of times negative emotions generate more engagement, that negative news is going to become the news cycle. If you release that bad news earlier in your cycle, even though it's the only thing that anyone has to talk about your game, it's not going to be as big of a deal. Some of those videos are still going to get made, but people aren't paying as much attention to your game. So that news isn't going to travel as far. And then when your news cycle is building, because you are reaching launch, the energy behind that piece of bad news is going to largely have dissipated. So you can, in a lot of cases, short circuit the bad actor influencer by releasing your bad news early. If your news is too close to launch, or if the news is so bad that the outrage can be sustained over a long period of time, it can go pretty badly. But to be honest, if your news is that bad, you are probably in much bigger trouble than you may realize. Hiding that piece of information is probably not going to save you. In most cases, people have other things to pay attention to. People have other things to be angry about. The influencers have other things to generate artificial outrage over. So if you get that news out early, you'll get that outrage, you'll get that content generated, but most of the time the attention will move on to other things before it's relevant to you in terms of what the messaging on your game is as you are actually coming out. There is some nuance to doing this. If you can't provide any context as to why you're putting robots in your high fantasy game, then it's possible the community won't move past it, that they will just build themselves up into worry. And then you can anchor their expectations in a negative place, and then you can end up with them having a negative reaction to the game when it launches. If you aren't careful in the way you are crafting your message, it can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is essentially what happened with Dragon Age 2. The new thing was that it was more mainstream, more action-focused. It was setting itself up as a different thing. But it wasn't providing the context to allow the community to digest that news and see the parts of the game that were still the same, or the parts of the game that maybe they would have liked better. And what you ended up with was a confirmation bias when the game came out. I'm worried that Dragon Age 2 has been dumbed down for the consoles because you said push a button and something awesome happens in the marketing of the game. And then when the game comes out and I see that in fact combat is different, all of my worries are locked into place. If instead you had presented push a button and something awesome happened, but then followed up with additional information, additional news, talking about some of the more traditional RPG elements in Dragon Age 2, you would have seen the community to some degree heal itself over this information. If your news is so bad that it's essentially unforgivable, similarly, you may not be able to recover from it. And your best bet might be to try to hide it in the news cycle of your launch. But that's a pretty defeatist attitude. If you are doing that, then you're basically admitting that whatever this piece of information is, it's so bad that it's going to destroy you. And rather than trying to deal with it, rather than trying to mitigate it, you're going to try to hide it and hope it doesn't hurt you too badly. Very rarely is the news that you're hiding from your community actually something of that degree. Usually, whatever you're doing has some good reasons, and you can explain those reasons. Or if it doesn't have good reasons, it's more a matter of personal taste. And people can adapt to changes in art direction, changes in tone, if they're given a certain amount of time to live in that environment, to get used to the change. A lot of people react to change negatively because it feels unsafe. With time, they can get used to a new normal. So if the news is simply change, then you are well served by getting that out in front of the community early so they can get used to that change. It is incredibly unusual that the piece of news that you're choosing to hide from the community is actually worth hiding. Most of the time, if you choose to keep it a secret, it's going to come out at an inopportune moment You're going to lose your ability to contextualize that information. You are going to weaken your relationship with your community because you're simply talking to them less. And rather than having this be a bad piece of news that comes out 6 months before your launch that you're able to recover from and contextualize and potentially even build upon, it becomes a bad news story that comes out on the day of your launch that can, in some cases, completely destroy the launch of a game. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you are more comfortable supporting the channel in that way. Both channel members and members of the Patreon get access to our Discord, which is a great way to interact with our community to a deeper level. This is essentially a response to myself to some degree, to my video on transparency. While I don't think transparency builds trust, I also feel that in almost all cases, you are much better off having a two-way, relatively high volume communication channel with your fans, with your players, because it gives you a way to provide them with the news that sometimes they're not going to like. If you don't have that channel, if you hide everything from them, then they are going to tend to react to things more negatively. And the moment when they're reacting to things is usually going to be the worst possible moment. I'm in the process of decommissioning my potato, so this is the first video I'm making on the new PC. If you notice anything weird, let me know in the comments, because there's a good chance I have one of the knobs set to the wrong number. And we'll see if we can dial this in over the next couple of videos. I will see you again soon. Thank you.